The Alchemists. Dissatisfaction with this lot seems to be the characteristic of man in all ages and climates. So far, however, from being an evil, as at first might be supposed, it has been the great civilizer of our race, and has tended more than anything else to raise us above the condition of the brutes. But the same discontent which has been the source of all improvement has been the parent of no small progeny of follies and absurdities. To trace these latter is our present object. Vast as the subject appears, it is easily reducible within such limits as will make it comprehensive without being wearisome, and render its study both instructive and amusing. Three causes especially have excited the discontent of mankind, and by impelling us to seek for remedies for the irremediable, have bewildered us in a maze of madness and error. These are death, toil, and ignorance of the future, the doom of man upon this sphere, and for which he shows his antipathy by his love of life, his longing for abundance, and his craving curiosity to pierce the secrets of the days to come. The first has led many to imagine that they might find means to avoid death, or, failing in this, that they might, nevertheless, so prolong existence as to reckon it by centuries instead of units. From this sprang the search, so long continued and still pursued, for the elixir vitae, or water of life, which has led thousands to pretend to it and millions to believe in it. From the second sprang the search for the philosopher's stone, which was to create plenty by changing all metals into gold. And from the third, the false sciences of astrology, divination, and their divisions of necromancy, chiromancy, augury, with all their train of signs, portents, and omens. In tracing the career of the erring philosophers or the willful cheats who have encouraged or preyed upon the credulity of mankind, it will simplify and elucidate the subject if we divide it into three classes. The first comprising alchemists, or those in general who have devoted themselves to the discovering of the philosopher's stone and the water of life. The second comprising astrologers, necromancers, sorcerers, geomancers, and all those who pretended to discover futurity. And the third consisting of the dealers in charms, amulets, philters, universal panacea mongers, touchers for the evil, seventh sons of a seventh son, sympathetic powder compounders, homeopathists, animal magnetizers, and all the motley tribe of quacks, empirics, and charlatans. But in narrating the career of such men, it will be found that many of them united several or all of the functions just mentioned. That the alchemist was a fortune teller or a necromancer, that he pretended to cure all maladies by touch or charm, and to work miracles of every kind. In the dark and early ages of European history, this is more especially the case. Even as we advance to more recent periods, we shall find great difficulty in separating the characters. The alchemist seldom confined himself strictly to his pretended science, the sorcerer and necromancer to theirs, or the medical charlatan to his. Beginning with alchemy, some confusion of these classes is unavoidable, but the ground will clear for us as we advance. Let us not, in the pride of our superior knowledge, turn with contempt from the follies of our predecessors. The study of the errors into which great minds have fallen in the pursuit of truth can never be uninstructive. As the man looks back to the days of his childhood and his youth, and recalls to his mind the strange notions and false opinions that swayed his actions at that time, that he may wonder at them, so should society, for its edification, look back to the opinions which governed the ages fled. He is but a superficial thinker who would despise and refuse to hear of them merely because they are absurd. No man is so wise but that he may learn some wisdom from his past errors, either of thought or action. And no society has made such advances as to be incapable of improvement from the retrospect of its past folly and credulity. And not only is such a study instructive, he who reads for amusement only will find no chapter in the annals of the human mind more amusing than this. It opens out the whole realm of fiction, the wild, the fantastic, and the wonderful, and all the immense variety of things that are not and cannot be, but that have been imagined and believed. For more than 1,000 years, the art of alchemy captivated many noble spirits and was believed in by millions. Its origin is involved in obscurity. Some of its devotees have claimed for it an antiquity coeval with the creation of man himself. Others again would trace it no further back than the time of Noah. Vincent de Beauvais argues, indeed, that all the antediluvians must have possessed a knowledge of alchemy, and particularly cites Noah as having been acquainted with the elixir vitae, or he could not have lived to so prodigious an age, and have begotten children when upwards of 500. Lenglet du Fresnoy, in his History of the Hermetic Philosophy, says, Most of them pretended that Shem or Chem, the son of Noah, was an adept in the art and thought it highly probable that the words chemistry and alchemy are both derived from his name. Others say the art was derived from the Egyptians, amongst whom it was first founded by Hermes Trismegistus. Moses, who is looked upon as a first-rate alchemist, gained his knowledge in Egypt, but he kept it all to himself and would not instruct the children of Israel in its mysteries. All the writers upon alchemy triumphantly cite the story of the golden calf in the 32nd chapter of Exodus to prove that this great lawgiver was an adept and could make or unmake gold at his pleasure. It is recorded that Moses was so wrath with the Israelites for their idolatry that he took the calf which they had made and burned it in the fire and ground it to powder and strewed it upon the water and made the children of Israel drink of it. This, say the alchemists, he never could have done had he not been in possession of the philosopher's stone. By no other means could he have made the powder of gold float upon the water. But we must leave this knotty point for the consideration of the adepts in the art, if any such there be, and come to more modern periods of its history. The Jesuit Father Martini, in his Historia Sinica, says it was practiced by the Chinese 2,500 years before the birth of Christ. But his assertion, being unsupported, is worth nothing. It would appear, however, that pretenders to the art of making gold and silver existed in Rome in the first centuries after the Christian era, and that, when discovered, they were liable to punishment as knaves and impostors. At Constantinople in the 4th century, the transmutation of metals was very generally believed in, and many of the Greek ecclesiastics wrote treatises upon the subject. Their names are preserved and some notice of their works given in the 3rd volume of Lenglet du Fresnoy's History of the Hermetic Philosophy. Their notion appears to have been that all metals were composed of two substances, the one metallic earth, and the other a red inflammable matter, which they called sulfur. The pure union of these substances formed gold, but other metals were mixed with and contaminated by various foreign ingredients. The object of the philosopher's stone was to dissolve or neutralize all these ingredients, by which iron, lead, copper, and all metals would be transmuted into the original gold. Many learned and clever men wasted their time, their health, and their energies in this vain pursuit. But for several centuries it took no great hold upon the imagination of the people. The history of the delusion appears, in a manner, lost from this time till the 8th century when it appeared amongst the Arabians. From this period it becomes easier to trace its progress. A master then appeared, who was long looked upon as the father of the science, and whose name is indissolubly connected with it. Of this philosopher called Geber, who devoted his life to the study of alchemy, few particulars are known. He is thought to have lived in the year 730. His true name was Abu Musa Ja'far, to which was added al-Sofi, or the Wise, and he was born at Huran in Mesopotamia. Some have thought he was a Greek, others a Spaniard, and others a prince of Hindustan. But of all the mistakes which have been made respecting him, the most ludicrous was that made by the French translator of Sprenger's History of Medicine, who thought from the sound of his name that he was a German, and rendered it as the donateur, or Geber. No details of his life are known, but it is asserted that he wrote more than 500 works upon the philosopher's stone and the water of life. He was a great enthusiast in his art, and compared the incredulous to little children shut up in a narrow room, without windows or aperture, who, because they saw nothing beyond, denied the existence of the great globe itself. He thought that a preparation of gold would cure all maladies, not only in man, but in the inferior animals and plants. He also imagined that all the metals labored under disease, with the exception of gold, which was the only one in perfect health. He affirmed that the secret of the philosopher's stone had been more than once discovered, but that the ancient and wise men who had hit upon it would never, by word or writing, communicate it to men, because of their unworthiness and incredulity. But the life of Geber, though spent in the pursuit of this vain chimera, was not altogether useless. He stumbled upon discoveries which he did not seek, and science is indebted to him for the first mention of corrosive sublimate, the red oxide of mercury, nitric acid, and the nitrate of silver. For more than 200 years after the death of Geber, the Arabian philosophers devoted themselves to the study of alchemy, joining with it that of astrology. Of these, the most celebrated was Alfarabi. Alfarabi flourished at the commencement of the 10th century and enjoyed the reputation of being one of the most learned men of his age. He spent his life in traveling from country to country, that he might gather the opinions of philosophers upon the great secrets of nature. No danger dismayed him, no toil wearied him of the pursuit. Many sovereigns endeavored to retain him at their courts, but he refused to rest until he had discovered the great object of his life, the art of preserving it for centuries, and of making gold as much as he needed. This wandering mode of life at last proved fatal to him. He had been on a visit to Mecca, not so much for religious as for philosophical purposes, when, returning through Syria, he stopped at the court of the Sultan Saifadouleh, who was renowned as the patron of learning. He presented himself in his traveling attire in the presence of that monarch and his courtiers, and without invitation, coolly sat himself down on the sofa beside the prince. The courtiers and wise men were indignant, and the Sultan, who did not know the intruder, was at first inclined to follow their example. He turned to one of his officers and ordered him to eject the presumptuous stranger from the room. But Alfarabi, without moving, dared them to lay hands upon him, and turning himself calmly to the prince, remarked that he did not know who was his guest, or he would treat him with honor, not with violence. The Sultan, instead of being still further incensed, as many potentates would have been, admired his coolness, and requesting him to sit still closer to him on the sofa, entered into a long conversation with him upon science and divine philosophy. All the court were charmed with the stranger. Questions for discussion were propounded, on all of which he showed superior knowledge. He convinced everyone who ventured to dispute with him, and spoke so eloquently upon the science of alchemy that he was at once recognized as only second to the great Geber himself. One of the doctors present inquired whether a man who knew so many sciences was acquainted with music. Alfarabi made no reply, but merely requested that a lute should be brought him. The lute was brought, and he played such ravishing and tender melodies that all the court were melted into tears. He then changed his theme and played airs so sprightly that he set the grave philosophers, a sultan and all, dancing as fast as their legs could carry them. He then sobered them again by a mournful strain and made them sob and sigh as if broken-hearted. The sultan, highly delighted with his powers, entreated him to stay, offering him every inducement that wealth, power, and dignity could supply. But the alchemist resolutely refused, it being decreed, he said, that he should never repose till he had discovered the philosopher's stone. He set out accordingly the same evening and was murdered by some thieves in the deserts of Syria. His biographers give no further particulars of his life beyond mentioning that he wrote several valuable treatises on his art, all of which, however, have been lost. His death happened in the year 954. Avicenna, whose real name was Ibn Sina, another great alchemist, was born at Bokhara in 980. His reputation as a physician and a man skilled in all sciences was so great that the Sultan Magdal-Duleth resolved to try his powers in the great science of government. He was accordingly made Grand Vizier of that prince and ruled the state with some advantage. But in a science still more difficult, he failed completely. He could not rule his own passions, but gave himself up to wine and women, and led a life of shameless debauchery. Amid the multifarious pursuits of business and pleasure, he nevertheless found time to write 7 treatises upon the philosopher's stone, which were for many ages looked upon as of great value by pretenders to the art. It is rare that an eminent physician, as Avicenna appears to have been, abandons himself to sensual gratification, but so completely did he become enthralled in the course of a few years that he was dismissed from his high office and died shortly afterwards of premature old age and a complication of maladies brought on by debauchery. His death took place in the year 1036. After his time, few philosophers of any note in Arabia are heard of as devoting themselves to the study of alchemy. But it began shortly afterwards to attract greater attention in Europe. Learned men in France, England, Spain, and Italy expressed their belief in the science, and many devoted their whole energies to it. In the 12th and 13th centuries especially, it was extensively pursued, and some of the brightest names of that age are connected with it. Among the most eminent of them are Albertus Magnus and Thomas Aquinas. The first of these philosophers was born in the year 1193 of a noble family at Lauingen, in the Duchy of Neuburg on the Danube. For the first 30 years of his life he appeared remarkably dull and stupid, and it was feared by everyone that no good could come of him. He entered a Dominican monastery at an early age, but made so little progress in his studies that he was more than once upon the point of abandoning them in despair. But he was endowed with extraordinary perseverance. As he advanced to middle age, his mind expanded, and he learned whatever he applied himself to with extreme facility. So remarkable a change was not in that age to be accounted for, but by a miracle. It was asserted and believed that the Holy Virgin, touched with his great desire to become learned and famous, took pity upon his incapacity, and appeared to him in the cloister where he sat almost despairing, and asked him whether he wished to excel in philosophy or divinity. He chose philosophy to the chagrin of the Virgin, who reproached him in mild and sorrowful accents that he had not made a better choice. She, however, granted his request that he should become the most excellent philosopher of the age, but set this drawback to his pleasure that he should relapse, when at the height of his fame, into his former incapacity and stupidity. Albertus never took the trouble to contradict the story, but prosecuted his studies with such unremitting zeal that his reputation speedily spread over all Europe. In the year 1244, the celebrated Thomas Aquinas placed himself under his tuition. Many extraordinary stories are told of the master and his pupil. While they paid all due attention to other branches of science, they never neglected the pursuit of the philosopher's stone and the elixir vitae. Although they discovered neither, it was believed that Albert had seized some portion of the secret of life and found means to animate a brazen statue, upon the formation of which, under proper conjunctions of the planets, he had been occupied many years of his life. He and Thomas Aquinas completed it together, endowed it with the faculty of speech, and made it perform the functions of a domestic servant. In this capacity it was exceedingly useful, but through some defect in the machinery it chattered much more than was agreeable to either philosopher. Various remedies were tried to cure it of its garrulity, but in vain. And one day, Thomas Aquinas was so enraged at the noise it made when he was in the midst of a mathematical problem that he seized a ponderous hammer and smashed it to pieces. He was sorry afterwards for what he had done, and was reproved by his master for giving way to his anger, so unbecoming in a philosopher. They made no attempt to reanimate the statue. Such stories as these show the spirit of the age. Every great man who attempted to study the secrets of nature was thought a magician. And it is not to be wondered at that when philosophers themselves pretended to discover an elixir for conferring immortality, or a red stone which was to create boundless wealth, that popular opinion should have enhanced upon their pretensions, and have endowed them with powers still more miraculous. It was believed of Albertus Magnus that he could even change the course of the seasons, a feat which the many thought less difficult than the discovery of the grand elixir. Albertus was desirous of obtaining a piece of ground on which to build a monastery in the neighborhood of Cologne. The ground belonged to William, Count of Holland and King of the Romans, who for some reason or other did not wish to part with it. Albertus is reported to have gained it by the following extraordinary method. He invited the prince as he was passing through Cologne to a magnificent entertainment prepared for him and all his court. The prince accepted it and repaired with a lordly retinue to the residence of the sage. It was in the midst of winter, the Rhine was frozen over, and the cold was so bitter that the knights could not sit on horseback without running the risk of losing their toes by the frost. Great, therefore, was their surprise on arriving at Albert's house to find that the repast was spread in his garden, in which the snow had drifted to the depth of several feet. The earl in high dudgeon remounted his steed, but Albert at last prevailed upon him to take his seat at the table. He had no sooner done so than the dark clouds rolled away from the sky. A warm sun shone forth. The cold north wind veered suddenly round and blew a mild breeze from the south. The snows melted away. The ice was unbound upon the streams, and the trees put forth their green leaves and their fruit. Flowers sprang up beneath their feet, while larks, nightingales, blackbirds, cuckoos, thrushes, and every sweet songbird sang hymns from every tree. The earl and his attendants wondered greatly, but they ate their dinner, and in recompense for it, Albert got his piece of ground to build a convent on. He had not, however, shown them all his power. Immediately that the repast was over, he gave the word, and dark clouds obscured the sun. The snow fell in large flakes. The singing birds fell dead. The leaves dropped from the trees, and the winds blew so cold and howled so mournfully that the guests wrapped themselves up in their thick cloaks, and retreated into the house to warm themselves at the blazing fire in Albert's kitchen. Thomas Aquinas also could work wonders as well as his master. It is related of him that he lodged in a street at Cologne, where he was much annoyed by the incessant clatter made by the horses' hoofs, as they were led through it daily to exercise by their grooms. He had entreated the latter to select some other spot, where they might not disturb a philosopher, but the grooms turned a deaf ear to all his solicitations. In this emergency he had recourse to the aid of magic. He constructed a small horse of bronze, upon which he inscribed certain cabalistic characters, and buried it at midnight in the midst of the highway. The next morning a troop of grooms came riding along as usual. But the horses, as they arrived at the spot where the magic horse was buried, reared and plunged violently, their nostrils distended with terror, their manes grew erect, and the perspiration ran down their sides in streams. In vain the riders applied the spur, in vain they coaxed or threatened, the animals would not pass the spot. On the following day their success was no better. They were at length compelled to seek another spot for their exercise, and Thomas Aquinas was left in peace. Albertus Magnus was made Bishop of Ratisbon in 1259, but he occupied the see only 4 years when he resigned, on the ground that its duties occupied too much of the time, which he was anxious to devote to philosophy. He died in Cologne in 1280 at the advanced age of 87. The Dominican writers deny that he ever sought the philosopher's stone, but his treatise upon minerals sufficiently proves that he did. Artephius, a name noted in the annals of alchemy, was born in the early part of the 12th century. He wrote 2 famous treatises, the one upon the philosopher's stone and the other on the art of prolonging human life. In the latter, he vaunts his great qualifications for instructing mankind on such a matter, as he was at that time in the 1025th year of his age. He had many disciples who believed in his extreme age and who attempted to prove that he was Apollonius of Tyana, who lived soon after the advent of Jesus Christ, and the particulars of whose life and pretended miracles have been so fully described by Philostratus. He took good care never to contradict a story which so much increased the power he was desirous of wielding over his fellow mortals. On all convenient occasions he boasted of it, and having an excellent memory, a fertile imagination, and a thorough knowledge of all existing history, he was never at a loss for an answer when questioned as to the personal appearance, the manners, or the character of the great men of antiquity. He also pretended to have found the philosopher's stone and said that, in search of it, he had descended to hell and seen the devil sitting on a throne of gold, with a legion of imps and fiends around him. His works on alchemy have been translated into French and were published in Paris in 1609 or 1610. Contemporary with Albertus Magnus was Alain de Lille of Flanders, who was named, from his great learning, the universal doctor. He was thought to possess a knowledge of all the sciences and, like Artephius, to have discovered the elixir vitae. He became one of the friars of the Abbey of Citeaux and died in 1298, aged about 110 years. It was said of him that he was at the point of death when in his 50th year, but that the fortunate discovery of the elixir enabled him to add 60 years to his existence. He wrote a commentary on the prophecies of Merlin. Arnold de Villeneuve has left a much greater reputation. He was born in the year 1245 and studied medicine with great success in the University of Paris. He afterwards traveled for 20 years in Italy and Germany, where he made acquaintance with Pietro de Pone, a man of a character akin to his own, and addicted to the same pursuits. As a physician, he was thought in his own lifetime to be the most able the world had ever seen. Like all the learned men of that day, he dabbled in astrology and alchemy, and was thought to have made immense quantities of gold from lead and copper. When Pietro de Pone was arrested in Italy and brought to trial as a sorcerer, a similar accusation was made against Arnold, but he managed to leave the country in time and escape the fate of his unfortunate friend. He lost some credit by predicting the end of the world, but afterwards regained it. The time of his death is not exactly known, but it must have been prior to the year 1311, when Pope Clement V wrote a circular letter to all the clergy of Europe who lived under his obedience, praying them to use their utmost efforts to discover the famous treatise of Arnold on the practice of medicine. The author had promised, during his lifetime, to make a present of the work to the Holy See, but died without fulfilling it. In a very curious work by Monsieur Langeville Arcueil, entitled The History of the Persons Who Have Lived Several Centuries and Then Grown Young Again, there is a receipt, said to have been given by Arnold de Villeneuve, by means of which anyone might prolong his life for a few hundred years or so. In the first place, say Arnold and Monsieur Arcueil, the person intending so to prolong his life must rub himself well, 2 or 3 times a week, with the juice or marrow of cassia. Every night, upon going to bed, he must put upon his heart a plaster, composed of a certain quantity of oriental saffron, red rose leaves, sandalwood, aloes, and amber, liquefied in oil of roses and the best white wax. In the morning he must take it off and enclose it carefully in a leaden box till the next night, when it must be again applied. If he be of a sanguine temperament, he shall take 16 chickens, if phlegmatic, 25, and if melancholy, 30, which he shall put into a yard where the air and the water are pure. Upon these he is to feed, eating 1 a day, but previously the chickens are to be fattened by a peculiar method, which will impregnate their flesh with the qualities that are to produce longevity in the eater. Being deprived of all other nourishment till they are almost dying of hunger, they are to be fed upon broth made of serpents and vinegar, which broth is to be thickened with wheat and bran. Various ceremonies are to be performed in the cooking of this mess, which those may see in the book of Meru Arquet, who are at all interested in the matter. And the chickens are to be fed upon it for 2 months. They are then fit for table and are to be washed down with moderate quantities of good white wine or claret. This regimen is to be followed regularly every 7 years, and anyone may live to be as old as Methuselah. It is right to state that Monsieur Arcueil has but little authority for attributing this precious composition to Arnold of Villeneuve. It is not found in the collected works of that philosopher, but was first brought to light by a Monsieur Poirier at the commencement of the 16th century, who asserted that he had discovered it in MS in the undoubted writing of Arnold. Pietro de Pone was born at Apone, near Padua, in the year 1250. Like his friend Arnold de Villeneuve, he was an eminent physician and a pretender to the arts of astrology and alchemy. He practiced for many years in Paris and made great wealth by killing and curing and telling fortunes. In an evil day for him, he returned to his own country with the reputation of being a magician of the first order. It was universally believed that he had drawn 7 evil spirits from the infernal regions, whom he kept enclosed in 7 crystal vases until he required their services, when he sent them forth to the ends of the earth to execute his pleasure. One spirit excelled in philosophy, a second in alchemy, a third in astrology, a fourth in physic, a fifth in poetry, a sixth in music, and the 7th in painting. And whenever Pietro wished for information or instruction in any of these arts, he had only to go to his crystal vase and liberate the presiding spirit. Immediately all the secrets of the art were revealed to him, and he might, if it pleased him, excel Homer in poetry, Apelles in painting, or Pythagoras himself in philosophy. Although he could make gold out of brass, it was said of him that he was very sparing of his powers in that respect, and kept himself constantly supplied with money by other and less creditable means. Whenever he disbursed gold, he muttered a certain charm, known only to himself, and next morning the gold was safe again in his own possession. The trader to whom he gave it might lock it in his strong box and have it guarded by a troop of soldiers, but the charmed metal flew back to its old master. Even if it were buried in the earth or thrown into the sea, the dawn of the next morning would behold it in the pockets of Pietro. Few people, in consequence, liked to have dealings with such a personage, especially for gold. Some, bolder than the rest, thought that his power did not extend over silver, but when they made the experiment, they found themselves mistaken. Bolts and bars could not restrain it, and it sometimes became invisible in their very hands, and was whisked through the air to the purse of the magician. He necessarily acquired a very bad character, and having given utterance to some sentiments regarding religion, which were the very reverse of orthodox, he was summoned before the tribunals of the Inquisition to answer for his crimes as a heretic and a sorcerer. He loudly protested his innocence, even upon the rack, where he suffered more torture than nature could support. He died in prison ere his trial was concluded, but was afterwards found guilty. His bones were ordered to be dug up and publicly burned. He was also burned in effigy in the streets of Padua. While Arnold de Villeneuve and Pietro da Pone flourished in France and Italy, a more celebrated adept than either appeared in Spain. This was Raymond Lulli, a name which stands in the first rank among the alchemists. Unlike many of his predecessors, he made no pretensions to astrology or necromancy, but taking Geber for his model, studied intently the nature and composition of metals, without reference to charms, incantations, or any foolish ceremonies. It was not, however, till late in life that he commenced his study of the art. His early and middle age were spent in a different manner, and his whole history is romantic in the extreme. He was born of an illustrious family in Majorca in the year 1235. When that island was taken from the Saracens by James I, King of Aragon, in 1230, the father of Raymond, who was originally of Catalonia, settled there and received a considerable appointment from the crown. Raymond married at an early age, and being fond of pleasure, he left the solitudes of his native isle and passed over with his bride into Spain. He was made Grand Seneschal at the court of King James and led a happy life for several years. Faithless to his wife, he was always in the pursuit of some new beauty, till his heart was fixed at last by the lovely but unkind Ambrosia de Castello. This lady, like her admirer, was married, but unlike him was faithful to her vows and treated all his solicitations with disdain. Raymond was so enamored that repulse only increased his flame. He lingered all night under her windows, wrote passionate verses in her praise, neglected his affairs, and made himself the butt of all the courtiers. One day, while watching under her lattice, he by chance caught sight of her bosom as her neckerchief was blown aside by the wind. The fit of inspiration came over him, and he sat down and composed some tender stanzas upon the subject, and sent them to the lady. The fair Ambrosia had never before condescended to answer his letters, but she replied to this. She told him that she could never listen to his suit, that it was unbecoming in a wise man to fix his thoughts, as he had done, on any other than his God, and entreated him to devote himself to a religious life and conquer the unworthy passion which he had suffered to consume him. She, however, offered, if he wished it, to show him the fair bosom which had so captivated him. Raymond was delighted. He thought the latter part of this epistle but ill corresponded with the former, and that Ambrosia, in spite of the good advice she gave him, had at last relented, and would make him as happy as he desired. He followed her about from place to place, entreating her to fulfill her promise. But still Ambrosia was cold, and implored him with tears to importune her no longer, for that she never could be his, and never would, if she were free tomorrow. "What means your letter, then?" said the despairing lover. "I will show you," replied Ambrosia, who immediately uncovered her bosom, and exposed to the eyes of her horror-stricken admirer a large cancer which had extended to both breasts. She saw that he was shocked, and extending her hand to him, she prayed him once more to lead a religious life, and set his heart upon the Creator, and not upon the creature. He went home an altered man. He threw up on the morrow his valuable appointment at the court, separated from his wife, and took a farewell of his children, after dividing one half of his ample fortune among them. The other half he shared among the poor. He then threw himself at the foot of a crucifix and devoted himself to the service of God, vowing as the most acceptable atonement for his errors that he would employ the remainder of his days in the task of converting the Mussulmans to the Christian religion. In his dreams he saw Jesus Christ, who said to him, "Raymond, Raymond, follow me." The vision was 3 times repeated, and Raymond was convinced that it was an intimation direct from heaven. Having put his affairs in order, he set out on a pilgrimage to the shrine of St. James of Compostela, and afterwards lived for 10 years in solitude amid the mountains of Aranda. Here he learned the Arabic to qualify himself for his mission of converting the Mahometans. He also studied various sciences as taught in the works of the learned men of the East, and first made acquaintance with the writings of Geber, which were destined to exercise so much influence over his future life. At the end of this probation, and when he had entered his 40th year, he emerged from his solitude into more active life. With some remains of his fortune, which had accumulated during his retirement, he founded a college for the study of Arabic, which was approved of by the Pope, with many commendations upon his zeal and piety. At this time he narrowly escaped assassination from an Arabian youth whom he had taken into his service. Raymond had prayed to God in some of his accesses of fanaticism that he might suffer martyrdom in his holy cause. His servant had overheard him, and, being as great a fanatic as his master, he resolved to gratify his wish and punish him at the same time for the curses which he incessantly launched against Mahomet and all who believed in him by stabbing him to the heart. He therefore aimed a blow at his master as he sat one day at table. But the instinct of self-preservation being stronger than the desire of martyrdom, Raymond grappled with his antagonist and overthrew him. He scorned to take his life himself, but handed him over to the authorities of the town, by whom he was afterwards found dead in his prison. After this adventure, Raymond traveled to Paris, where he resided for some time, and made the acquaintance of Arnold de Villeneuve. From him he probably received some encouragement to search for the philosopher's stone, as he began from that time forth to devote less of his attention to religious matters and more to the study of alchemy. Still, he never lost sight of the great object for which he lived, the conversion of the Mohammedans, and proceeded to Rome to communicate personally with Pope John the 21st on the best measures to be adopted for that end. The Pope gave him encouragement in words, but failed to associate any other persons with him in the enterprise which he meditated. Raymond, therefore, set out for Tunis alone, and was kindly received by many Arabian philosophers, who had heard of his fame as a professor of alchemy. If he had stuck to alchemy while in their country, it would have been well for him, but he began cursing Mahomet and got himself into trouble. While preaching the doctrines of Christianity in the great bazaar of Tunis, he was arrested and thrown into prison. He was shortly afterwards brought to trial and sentenced to death. Some of his philosophic friends interceded hard for him, and he was pardoned upon condition that he left Africa immediately and never again set foot in it. If he was found there again, no matter what his object might be or whatever length of time might intervene, his original sentence would be carried into execution. Raymond was not at all solicitous of martyrdom when it came to the point, whatever he might have been when there was no danger, and he gladly accepted his life upon these conditions, and left Tunis with the intention of proceeding to Rome. He afterwards changed his plan and established himself at Milan, where for a length of time he practiced alchemy and some say astrology with great success. Most writers who believed in the secrets of alchemy and who have noticed the life of Raymond Lulli assert that while in Milan he received letters from Edward, King of England, inviting him to settle in his states. They add that Lulli gladly accepted the invitation and had apartments assigned for his use in the Tower of London, where he refined much gold, superintended the coinage of rose nobles, and made gold out of iron, quicksilver, lead, and pewter to the amount of 6 millions. The writers in the Biographie Universelle, an excellent authority in general, deny that Raymond was ever in England, and say that in all these stories of his wondrous powers as an alchemist, he has been mistaken for another Raymond, a Jew of Tarragona. Naudet, in his Apology, says simply that 6 millions were given by Raymond Lulli to King Edward to make war against the Turks and other infidels. Not that he transmuted so much metal into gold, but, as he afterwards adds, that he advised Edward to lay a tax upon wool, which produced that amount. To show that Raymond went to England, his admirers quote a work attributed to him, De Transmutatione Anime Metallorum, in which he expressly says that he was in England at the intercession of the king. The Hermetic writers are not agreed whether it was Edward I or Edward II, who invited him over, but by fixing the date of his journey in 1312, they make it appear that it was Edward II. Edmund Dickinson, in his work on the quintessences of the philosophers, says that Raymond worked in Westminster Abbey, where, a long time after his departure, there was found in the cell which he had occupied a great quantity of golden dust, of which the architects made a great profit. In the biographical sketch of John Cremer, Abbot of Westminster, given by Lenglet, it is said that it was chiefly through his instrumentality that Raymond came to England. Cremer had been himself for 30 years occupied in the vain search for the philosopher's stone, when he accidentally met Raymond in Italy and endeavored to induce him to communicate his grand secret. Raymond told him that he must find it for himself, as all great alchemists had done before him. Cremer, on his return to England, spoke to King Edward in high terms of the wonderful attainments of the philosopher, and a letter of invitation was forthwith sent him. Robert Constantinus, in the Nomenclator Scriptorum Medicorum, published in 1515, says that, after a great deal of research, he found that Raymond Lulli resided for some time in London, and that he actually made gold by means of the philosopher's stone in the tower. That he had seen the golden pieces of his coinage, which were still named in England the nobles of Raymond, or rose nobles. Lulli himself appears to have boasted that he made gold, for in his well-known testamentum he states that he converted no less than 50,000 pounds weight of quicksilver, lead, and pewter into that metal. It seems highly probable that the English king, believing in the extraordinary powers of the alchemist, invited him to England to make test of them, and that he was employed in refining gold and in coining. Camden, who is not credulous in matters like these, affords his countenance to the story of his coinage of nobles, and there is nothing at all wonderful in the fact of a man famous for his knowledge of metals being employed in such a capacity. Raymond was at this time an old man in his 77th year and somewhat in his dotage. He was willing enough to have it believed that he had discovered the grand secret, and supported the rumor rather than contradicted it. He did not long remain in England, but returned to Rome to carry out the projects which were nearer to his heart than the profession of alchemy. He had proposed them to several successive popes with little or no success. The first was a plan for the introduction of the Oriental languages into all the monasteries of Europe. The second, for the reduction into one of all the military orders, that, being united, they might move more efficaciously against the Saracens. And the third, that the sovereign pontiff should forbid the works of Averroes to be read in the schools, as being more favorable to Mohammedanism than to Christianity. The Pope did not receive the old man with much cordiality, and after remaining for about 2 years in Rome, he proceeded once more to Africa, alone and unprotected, to preach the gospel of Jesus. He landed at Bona in 1314 and so irritated the Mohammedans by cursing their prophet that they stoned him and left him for dead on the seashore. He was found some hours afterwards by a party of Genoese merchants who conveyed him on board their vessel and sailed towards Majorca. The unfortunate man still breathed but could not articulate. He lingered in this state for some days and expired just as the vessel arrived within sight of his native shores. His body was conveyed with great pomp to the church of St. Eulalia at Palma, where a public funeral was instituted in his honor. Miracles were afterwards said to have been worked at his tomb. Thus ended the career of Raymond Lulli, one of the most extraordinary men of his age, and, with the exception of his last boast about the 6 millions of gold, the least inclined to quackery of any of the professors of alchemy. His writings were very numerous and include nearly 500 volumes upon grammar, rhetoric, morals, theology, politics, civil and canon law, physics, metaphysics, astronomy, medicine, and chemistry. The powerful delusion of alchemy seized upon a mind still greater than that of Raymond Lulli. Roger Bacon firmly believed in the philosopher's stone and spent much of his time in search of it. His example helped to render all the learned men of the time more convinced of its practicability and more eager in the pursuit. He was born at Ilchester, in the county of Somerset, in the year 1214. He studied for some time in the University of Oxford and afterwards in that of Paris, in which he received the degree of Doctor of Divinity. Returning to England in 1240, he became a monk of the Order of St. Francis. He was by far the most learned man of his age, and his acquirements were so much above the comprehension of his contemporaries that they could only account for them by supposing that he was indebted for them to the devil. To him, and apparently to him only among all the inquiring spirits of the time, were known the properties of the concave and convex lens. He also invented the magic lantern, that pretty plaything of modern days which acquired for him a reputation that embittered his life. In a history of alchemy, the name of this great man cannot be omitted, although, unlike many others of whom we shall have occasion to speak, he only made it secondary to other pursuits. The love of universal knowledge that filled his mind would not allow him to neglect one branch of science, of which neither he nor the world could yet see the absurdity. He made ample amends for his time lost in this pursuit by his knowledge in physics and his acquaintance with astronomy. The telescope, burning glasses, and gunpowder are discoveries which may well carry his fame to the remotest time, and make the world blind to the one spot of folly, the diagnosis of the age in which he lived, and the circumstances by which he was surrounded. His treatise on the admirable power of art and nature in the production of the philosopher's stone was translated into French by Girard de Tormes and published at Lyons in 1557. His Mirror of Alchemy was also published in French in the same year and in Paris in 1612, with some additions from the works of Raymond Lulli. A complete list of all the published treatises upon the subject may be seen in L'Anglais du Fresnoy. Pope John XXII is said to have been the friend and pupil of Arnold de Villeneuve, by whom he was instructed in all the secrets of alchemy. Tradition asserts of him that he made great quantities of gold and died as rich as Croesus. He was born at Cahors in the province of Guyenne in the year 1244. He was a very eloquent preacher and soon reached high dignity in the church. He wrote a work on the transmutation of metals and had a famous laboratory at Avignon. He issued 2 bulls against the numerous pretenders to the art who had sprung up in every part of Christendom, from which it might be inferred that he was himself free from the delusion. The alchemists claim him, however, as one of the most distinguished and successful professors of their art, and say that his bulls were not directed against the real adepts, but the false pretenders. He died in the year 1344, leaving in his coffers a sum of 18 millions of florins. Popular belief alleged that he had made and not amassed this treasure, and alchemists complacently cite this as a proof that the philosopher's stone was not such a chimera as the incredulous pretended. They take it for granted that John really left this money and ask by what possible means he could have accumulated it. Replying to their own question, they say triumphantly, "His book shows it was by alchemy, the secrets of which he learned from Arnold de Villeneuve and Raymond Lulli, but he was as prudent as all other Hermetic philosophers. Whoever would read his book to find out his secret would employ all his labor in vain. The Pope took good care not to divulge it. Unluckily for their own credit, all these gold makers are in the same predicament. Their great secret loses its worth most wonderfully in the telling, and therefore they keep it snugly to themselves." Perhaps they thought that if everybody could transmute metals, gold would be so plentiful that it would be no longer valuable, and that some new art would be requisite to transmute it back again into steel and iron. If so, society is much indebted to them for their forbearance. All classes of men dabbled in the art at this time. The last mentioned was a pope. The one of whom we now speak was a poet. Jean de Meung, the celebrated author of the Roman de la Rose, was born in the year 1279 or 1280, and was a great personage at the courts of Louis Zouang, Philip the Long, Charles IV, and Philip de Valois. His famous poem of the Roman de la Rose, which treats of every subject in vogue at that day, necessarily makes great mention of alchemy. Jean was a firm believer in the art, and wrote, besides his Roman, two shorter poems, the one entitled The Remonstrance of Nature to the Wandering Alchemist and The Reply of the Alchemist to Nature. Poetry and alchemy were his delight, and priests and women were his abomination. This naturally gave great offense, and being perceived one day in the king's antechamber by some ladies who were waiting for an audience, they resolved to punish him. To the number of 10 or 12, they armed themselves with canes and rods, and surrounding the unlucky poet, called upon the gentlemen present to strip him naked, that they might wreak just vengeance upon him and lash him through the streets of the town. Some of the lords present were in no wise loath, and promised themselves great sport from his punishment. But Jean de Meung was unmoved by their threats, and stood up calmly in the midst of them, begging them to hear him first, and then, if not satisfied, they might do as they liked with him. Silence being restored, he stood upon a chair and entered on his defense. He acknowledged that he was the author of the obnoxious verses, but denied that they bore reference to all womankind. He only meant to speak of the vicious and abandoned, whereas those whom he saw around him were patterns of virtue, loveliness, and modesty. If, however, any lady present thought herself aggrieved, he would consent to be stripped, and she might lash him till her arms were wearied. It is added that by this means Jean escaped his flogging, and that the wrath of the fair ones immediately subsided. The gentlemen present were, however, of opinion that if every lady in the room whose character corresponded with the verses had taken him at his word, the poet would in all probability have been beaten to death. All his life long he evinced a great animosity towards the priesthood, and his famous poem abounds with passages reflecting upon their avarice, cruelty, and immorality. At his death he left a large box filled with some weighty material, which he bequeathed to the Cordeliers as a peace offering, for the abuse he had lavished upon them. As his practice of alchemy was well known, it was thought the box was filled with gold and silver, and the Cordeliers congratulated each other on their rich acquisition. When it came to be opened, they found to their horror that it was filled only with slates, scratched with hieroglyphic and Kabbalistic characters. Indignant at the insult, they determined to refuse him Christian burial on pretense that he was a sorcerer. He was, however, honorably buried in Paris, the whole court attending his funeral. The story of Nicholas Flamel, as handed down by tradition and enshrined in the pages of Lenglet du Fresnoy, is not a little marvelous. He was born at Pontoise, of a poor but respectable family, at the end of the 13th or beginning of the 14th century. Having no patrimony, he set out for Paris at an early age, to try his fortune as a public scribe. He had received a good education, was well skilled in the learned languages, and was an excellent penman. He soon procured occupation as a letter writer and copyist, and used to sit at the corner of the Rue de Marivaux and practice his calling. But he hardly made profit enough to keep body and soul together. To mend his fortunes, he tried poetry, but this was a more wretched occupation still. As a transcriber, he had at least gained bread and cheese, but his rhymes were not worth a crust. He then tried painting with as little success, and as a last resource began to search for the philosopher's stone and tell fortunes. This was a happier idea. He soon increased in substance and had wherewithal to live comfortably. He therefore took unto himself his wife Petronella and began to save money, but continued to all outward appearance as poor and miserable as before. In the course of a few years he became desperately addicted to the study of alchemy, and thought of nothing but the philosopher's stone, the elixir of life, and the universal alkahest. In the year 1357 he bought by chance an old book for 2 florins, which soon became his sole study. It was written with a steel instrument upon the bark of trees and contained 21, or as he himself always expressed it, 3 times 7 leaves. The writing was very elegant and in the Latin language. Each 7th leaf contained a picture and no writing. On the first of these was a serpent swallowing rods, on the second a cross with a serpent crucified, and on the third the representation of a desert, in the midst of which was a fountain, with serpents crawling from side to side. It purported to be written by no less a personage than Abraham, patriarch, Jew, prince, philosopher, priest, Levite, and astrologer, and invoked curses upon anyone who should cast eyes upon it, without being a sacrificer or a scribe. Nicholas Flamel never thought it extraordinary that Abraham should have known Latin, and was convinced that the characters on his book had been traced by the hands of that great patriarch himself. He was at first afraid to read it after he became aware of the curse it contained, but he got over that difficulty by recollecting that, although he was not a sacrificer, he had practiced as a scribe. As he read, he was filled with admiration and found that it was a perfect treatise upon the transmutation of metals. All the processes were clearly explained: the vessels, the retorts, the mixtures, and the proper times and seasons for experiment. But as ill luck would have it, the possession of the philosopher's stone, or prime agent in the work, was presupposed. This was a difficulty which was not to be got over. It was like telling a starving man how to cook a beefsteak instead of giving him the money to buy one. But Nicholas did not despair and set about studying the hieroglyphics and allegorical representations with which the book abounded. He soon convinced himself that it had been one of the sacred books of the Jews, and that it was taken from the Temple of Jerusalem on its destruction by Titus. The process of reasoning by which he arrived at this conclusion is not stated. From some expression in the treatise, he learned that the allegorical drawings on the fourth and fifth leaves enshrined the secret of the philosopher's stone, without which all the fine Latin of the directions was utterly unavailing. He invited all the alchemists and learned men of Paris to come and examine them, but they all departed as wise as they came. Nobody could make anything either of Nicholas or his pictures, and some even went so far as to say that his invaluable book was not worth a farthing. This was not to be borne, and Nicholas resolved to discover the great secret by himself, without troubling the philosophers. He found on the first page of the fourth leaf the picture of Mercury attacked by an old man resembling Saturn or Time. The latter had an hourglass on his head, and in his hand a scythe with which he aimed a blow at Mercury's feet. The reverse of the leaf represented a flower growing on a mountain top, shaken rudely by the wind, with a blue stalk, red and white blossoms, and leaves of pure gold. Around it were a great number of dragons and griffins. On the first page of the fifth leaf was a fine garden, in the midst of which was a rose tree in full bloom, supported against the trunk of a gigantic oak. At the foot of this there bubbled up a fountain of milk-white water, which, forming a small stream, flowed through the garden and was afterwards lost in the sands. On the second page was a king, with a sword in his hand, superintending a number of soldiers who, in execution of his orders, were killing a great multitude of young children, spurning the prayers and tears of their mothers, who tried to save them from destruction. The blood of the children was carefully collected by another party of soldiers, and put into a large vessel, in which two allegorical figures of the sun and moon were bathing themselves. For 21 years poor Nicholas wearied himself with the study of these pictures, but still he could make nothing of them. His wife Petronella at last persuaded him to find out some learned rabbi, but there was no rabbi in Paris learned enough to be of any service to him. The Jews met but small encouragement to fix their abode in France, and all the chiefs of that people were located in Spain. To Spain, accordingly, Nicholas Flamel repaired. He left his book in Paris for fear, perhaps, that he might be robbed of it on the road, and telling his neighbors that he was going on a pilgrimage to the shrine of St. James of Compostela, he trudged on foot towards Madrid in search of a rabbi. He was absent 2 years in that country, and made himself known to a great number of Jews, descendants of those who had been expelled from France in the reign of Philip Augustus. The believers in the philosopher's stone give the following account of his adventures. They say that at Lyon he made the acquaintance of a converted Jew named Cautius, a very learned physician, to whom he explained the title and nature of his little book. The doctor was transported with joy as soon as he heard it named, and immediately resolved to accompany Nicholas to Paris, that he might have a sight of it. The two set out together, the doctor on the way entertaining his companion with the history of his book, which, if the genuine book he thought it to be, from the description he had heard of it, was in the handwriting of Abraham himself, and had been in the possession of personages no less distinguished than Moses, Joshua, Solomon, and Esdras. Thank you for watching until the end. If you want to go deep down into the rabbit hole of marketing and persuasion, click the link in the description where you will find many fundamental books about copywriting, psychology, and persuasion. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more videos like this one. See you in the next one.